Raveena Kumari Sethia, welcome to Digital Markets Research Hub. It's very nice to meet you again. And as you're an expert in Indian competition law, and as the channel is primarily dedicated to digital aspects of it, so I wanted to invite you to reflect upon the latest development in competition law in India with the focus on digital markets, but also to maybe to share your understanding of how these markets themselves are being organized, which factors help to shape them, to keep them fit, and maybe also to suggest what Europe is not doing right, and maybe where should the focus should be channeled at during this current economic and political situations and turbulences, perhaps. But let us
Yeah.
start with your reflection on the evolution of digital markets in India. So please tell us about the latest development, the dynamic, the energy which you observed there.
So digital markets are expanding rapidly in India. We have over 900 million internet users as of last year. I'm sure that's increased by now. E-commerce is growing exponentially. Every other month, you see small e-commerce companies sort of rise up and they're expanding, they're getting good funding. In fact, e-commerce is projected to exceed about 200 billion by 2026 in India, especially quick e-commerce is a very growing sector here. Apart from that, we have our digital payment service, which is UPI, which is the Unified Payments Interface. Again, government tech, but used across the board, which has really helped in pushing payments through from urban cities to rural areas. And we have in the digital economy as well, we have several startups which have now become unicorns and are success stories. So the digital markets are doing very well. India is being able to tap on a couple of things. Firstly, it's sheer number of people, right? We have so many people, our population itself is so high. So it's easy for a digital player, if they have a good product to get penetration quickly in the market and to be able to create a sort of brand readability depending on, which sphere of the market they're at. Apart from that, internet as well has, spread to various locations, including several villages and rural areas, which wasn't the case much earlier. So that's been an interesting development, and we see things expanding in that area with more and more access over time. And third big thing is smartphones are relatively inexpensive. You have smartphones ranging from a very low cost to, of course, our premium smartphones. So they've become accessible, which has really been a game changer. The consumer base has expanded across the board. So digital markets are doing very, very well. There is great telecom reach now. Internet and smartphones are more accessible. Unified payments interface has really done very well in helping in this expansion. And, we only see an upturn at this point.
I have a specific question about unified payment interfaces because it's a very interesting mechanism, also showing how the partnership between the regulatory authorities and the government more generally with private undertakings can deliver such visible results. But also it has some questions about maybe some privacy related or issues, maybe not. But let me ask it separately. But I wanted maybe to start this modality with the question on the relationship between the role of the government in shaping
Yeah.
digital markets, because one can say, well, population is huge, it's English speaking, or most people understand English, thus it was easy to integrate, the momentum is right, and thus it is just invisible, the coincidence of the factors which drive the invisible hand of the market. Is this story just yet another kind of Silicon Valley in the Indian context? Leaving aside the Silicon Valley is not purely hands-off approach, or there was a kind of strategic planning in helping India to achieve such high degree of digitization.
I think we do have, I won't say there's been deep planning and they have a 20-year plan that in every 2 years we're going to introduce some great tech. But there is a digital agenda, which is a combination of several changes that have come into place over time. So, and the government has played a very important role in sort of building digital markets in India as well. So, for instance, they started their pilot project, with great muster through what they call Aadhaar, which is the Universal Digital ID. Um, this was launched in 2009-ish, and it came into controversy subsequently a little bit after. In 2018, the Supreme Court held that it was largely constitutional. Most provisions were upheld by the majority. It's something that helps in linking your ID digitally. So then you can use your Aadhaar as a basis for various things, to claim government benefits. You can use it even today to enter an airport. They've introduced something new called Digi Yatra recently. And that's basically an ID proof for you at airports where there's facial recognition scanners at various airports. And once you've uploaded your digital ID, you just need to be there, show your face, and it lets you in various parameters. So from the main gate to security to even boarding. So that's been amazing to see how the linkages worked. Apart from that, as we spoke about, there is UPI, Unified Payments Interface, which came about much later, about in 2016. It really gained a lot of traction during COVID. And because it helped people make payments without physical contact, and it was all cashless without a physical card or anything else required. You can install any UPI app on your phone. And if you upload your bank account details on it, you can make a seamless transaction from your account to someone else's account within seconds in a hassle-free process without one-time passwords or as much bank fraud in the same manner. And this has seen about 10 billion transactions per month. It's also something that's used, from a practical point of view. It's not just something that you see in large stores or malls or fancy places. It's something that you will see in every mom and pop shop. Everybody uses UPI. You want to take public transport, you can pay through UPI for that. You want to buy something which is very expensive, worth thousands of dollars, you can use UPI for that as well. So it's something which has usability across the board and really is a concept that's helped people across India make quick, seamless payments and receive money without any hassle. Um, there have been other things as well, like instant identity verification called eKYC for banks, etc. You have to do KYC processes, which is know your customer. So they've done that through digital identity verification. There are other things like DigiLocker, which allow for digital document storage. Again, a government initiative. They also now, as a government, have an open e-commerce network called ONDC. This essentially aims to connect people in a marketplace format. And, unlike traditional marketplaces which charge a commission, this is a government run sort of platform where you can find players across industries on one portal and kind of connect with them. So there's been a lot that the government's done over the last couple of years. We've seen most of the changes come in the last decade only. And it seems to be a primary focus for them to use digital resources to help in growth and expansion. It doesn't seem to be something that's a one-off sporadic Silicon Valley moment, but it seems to be something that they want to integrate over time, in terms of as much as they can to digitize things and make, rural India especially more digitally self-sufficient. So they've played a huge role and it's, made a big difference here.
And what about the markets which are most susceptible to entrenchments, like, for example, search, or less susceptible, such as social media? Is there any specific development in India, or is it just scaled up situation of Europe and the United States?
I won't say India is at the same level as the United States or Europe. In terms of various social media services or in terms of platforms, app stores, search, etc. We do have situations, and we'll get to that, I'm sure, subsequently, where certain conduct has been looked at by the regulators, and not just the CCI, which is the competition regulator, but other government regulators as well. And they've tried to find immediate solutions to those problems where applicable. In certain cases, it's been a hit. In certain cases, it's been a miss. But I won't say it mirrors the situation anywhere else in the world. The markets here develop at their own pace, and including all digital platforms and core digital services, if you would like to call it. They all have their own sort of way of growing and their trajectory.
And if you compare the state of affairs in digital markets and the boom of digital markets in India with other countries in the region, is it a trend which is cross-border essentially, or India is pioneer in that region?
I mean, the growth of digital markets is undisputed around the world. Everybody is tapping into it. And, from digital markets, now we're moving into more specific roles of digital players, like, say, AI platforms, providing more of a value add in each of these services. So it's a growth that you see around the world. As far as issues in these platforms or issues in these services are concerned, they need not be the same across every jurisdiction. So I think India has had its own set of problems or its own set of considerations, which have been specific to it, which need not be the same as those around the world.
And the final introductory question about Indian large companies and digital markets, how they interact with the government, and what is their self-perception? Do they plan to expand? Do they want to become universal global players, or the digital markets in India are so large that it's of secondary importance to go beyond the borders? And how do they interact with the traditional big tech players?
Yeah. I think so. Firstly, while these players originate from India, they do over time look for global expansion. However, that's not something that they necessarily need to do to be profitable. The domestic market is strong enough for them to be big players, and several of them from startups have become unicorns in very short periods of time. So that bears testament to the growth potential here for such players. Um, we already have a very large consumer base because of population. As I said, we have good digital government infrastructure, which is really pushing these players. For certain sectors, there are government exemptions, and there are specific benefits that players in certain sectors get depending on the product they develop, so they can benefit from that. And they also have the benefit of regulatory familiarity. So for a local company, it's a lot easier to develop and expand within the country because of understanding the markets and understanding the regulation process, as compared to immediately stepping out into the world and trying to deal with multi-jurisdictional regulatory hassles and growth opportunities. So it isn't really as um, important for them as it might be for, say, another player in a smaller European country to expand at least Europe-wide, if not country-wide. India can, provide a self-sustaining ecosystem for these companies, which we've seen in practice to really work out. Be it e-commerce, food delivery, ed tech, fintech, everything sees we have players who are large, who are sustainable, and who are growing, which are all local and raised from ground up here. So that's been really great to see. But there are certain players, for example, depending on the product that they make. So if it's a CRM product or an EdTech product or IT services, those become more easily scalable. And then you see those entities expanding more globally, right? So like Infosys is a good example, or Wipro or TCS. These are companies that have expanded globally If you see in terms of hospitality, Oyo, which is a budget range of hotels here in India, now also has a Southeast Asian presence and, some sort of global presence otherwise as well. So it's also expanded slowly and carefully. But, these are easier to do as compared to other services which might be more localized, like food delivery. So it really depends on the industry.
On the regulatory side, we know that India is considering to adopt something akin to the DMA and DMCCA, and it is still a Digital Competition Act. It's still in the draft form.
Yeah.
So while it's quite a long process, yeah. So we remember the discussion a few years taking place a few years ago. So I have a few questions on this legislation, this landmark legislation. First of all, if we do see the motivation, so let's start with motivation. So if markets are booming, and if simplistically, stereotypically thinking, contrary to the situation in Europe, many of these digital markets, many of these core platform services have competition between the global big tech companies and its Indian equivalent or something of this kind in being in the pipeline. What does motivate the government to adopt such proactive legislation?
I think they started off with this legislation keeping in mind the growing need to regulate digital markets around the world. So it was more of a let's see what everyone else is doing and see if it's worth our time. There was a committee to consider this. The committee gave some recommendations. All of them perhaps don't feature in the bill, but most of them do. However, the bill itself is something that needs more work in its current form, but the motivation seems to have been to sort of get on a global bandwagon to understand if we need the same sort of regulation or not in India. And when it comes to core platform services, we as a jurisdiction are not immune. Perhaps for us, the sort of core platform service which has the largest impact is perhaps operating systems and their infrastructure. So Android is still a leading provider of operating systems and therefore things like the Play Store and market access. And most Indian startups, Indian companies, they rely on this infrastructure to reach their customers. So the limitations are similar than what we see in other jurisdictions. And therefore there probably was some thought regarding regulating such players or services so that Indian companies have a more level playing field to reach their audiences. But that said, the entire process has taken longer than expected. So the draft was released in 2024. There was a public consultation, and after that consultation, suggestions have been taken very seriously. About 100+ stakeholders submitted their suggestions, and now the latest news as of 4 to 5 days ago is that the parliamentary committee looking into this bill has asked the CCI for more clarifications. I think they need to reconsider the way they've defined enterprises that will form subject matter of this act. They're calling them SSDEs. They have to also consider the thresholds once again and consider the various sort of fail safes, exceptions, rules that they can sort of carve out for players to ensure that the entire digital ecosystem doesn't come to a crumbling standstill just because of ex ante regulation that wasn't thought through. So I think that's where we're at with this bill. The intention was perhaps a good one, but there is a long road to it being implemented in the right way.
And if we look at the traditional models which are being present, probably the EU and UK acts were inspiring the drafters of the Indian bill uh, to large extent, at least from the perspective of kind of legal technicalities. So I wonder what can we take as a main takeaway? Is it primarily DMA focused act in terms of juristic mechanisms, or the inspiration is more from the DMCCA?
Um, Perhaps more from the DMA, but that said, I don't think, unfortunately or fortunately, it doesn't even mirror that counterpart in the same manner. So, for example, the current iteration of the draft bill doesn't even have a provision for interoperability. There is no sort of like an entity gets redesignated automatically within 3 years unless they apply themselves for the commission to consider that they shouldn't be designated. So there's no power that the commission has suo motu to remove a designation as well. And while they have a wider net to include more companies, they don't have any exceptions built in from which they could actually, where they see while an entity may be meeting thresholds on paper, they don't actually exercise that influence. So they don't have that as yet built into the bill. So I don't think they've even the inspiration doesn't seem to have translated fully, and there's a lot for the bill to work on in its current form. So I don't think maybe it's its own domestic creation inspired by the DMA and other provisions, and still trying to find its ground.
Uh, so, and thus it implies that it can be that the designation thresholds can be set slightly lower than one would expect it from this kind of gatekeeper or undertaking with strategic market status, and thus being
Yeah.
rather more in the shape of the DSA, perhaps rather than the DMA.
Yeah, the thresholds are surprisingly very low. So perhaps on that front, there is some comparison, but uh, it isn't even a fair sort of comparison because the criteria is a little bit different, and it would end up leading to players that weren't really intended to be part of this regime to also come under the scanner. So that's been a key point that stakeholders have launched, and they've tried to build discussion over it. And we hope that the final iteration of the bill does reconsider those thresholds.
And what about the mechanisms like efficiency defense and overall remedies? How do they represent the interest of digital markets? Which models are they?
It's I wouldn't even compare it to a model, but I would say there's a long way to go for that as well. There are obligations that these companies have to adhere to, which are proactive, positive obligations, and this will run in parallel, side by side with ex post regulation. So it's going to be a task to see how remedies and ex post tie with obligations ex ante and how they try to find a common ground. That's one. The second issue is, in India, we have regulation for various things. There is a Data Protection Act, which is also in the process of being enforced. And there are other regulations, for example, IT laws, and, other stakeholders and regulators that have jurisdiction and control over digital markets. So the larger picture in India is going to be perhaps a situation of over-regulation where we'll have to see how various regulators come together to find a balance. Otherwise, the market might really hit a standstill. So I can't even really compare it to another jurisdiction because our situation is a bit more unique.
But do you think that the Competition Commission is interested in doing more kind of regulatory role, in pursuing more regulatory role, doing micromanagement of shaping digital markets, or maybe competition in digital markets in a proactive way, or it is something which has not been created in the Commission's lap, and it's something which has been kind of granted by the government rather?
Yeah, see, the commission has traditionally been more hands-off, and they repeatedly say that they aren't a price regulator. They've said that as recently as a Android TV settlement decision as of, April. So they repeatedly say they're not a price regulator. They don't want to come in and comment on how players should design their practices unless it's, extremely necessary. So I don't know. I don't think it would be accurate to say that they are here to shape the way the digital markets in India develop singularly or single-handedly. But I think they're here to see how they can find a level playing field and address a concern when it's brought to them with some merit. So this seems to be something which I'm sure they're also closely looking into to understand what the correct contours of their jurisdiction ought to be as well.
Great. So tell us maybe a little bit more about this Android TV recent case.
Yeah, so this is the first settlement order that's been published by the CCI as early as last month. So there was allegations around Google's Android television sort of partnerships where they would tie up with OEMs and they had agreements where OEMs would have to, sign up for the Play Store and apart from that also sign up for other apps like YouTube. And, there would be obligations regarding placement and how those apps would be featured. And apart from that, there was also another condition where Android folks would not be compatible or considered compatible with these apps. So essentially, an OEM had to then have a TV with Android as its OS, and then the Play Store and all of these apps, within its sort of domain. But subsequently, this matter's been going on. The Director General issued its investigation report. This came at a time, luckily for Google, once the amendments to the Indian Competition Act had been notified. So they were able to take benefit of the newly notified settlements and commitments regime. This is the first decision under that new order. And they've already seen a setback from the CCI in the Android decision, which the appellate tribunal here upheld, which was regarding their general Android practices and Play Store practices on smartphones. So it's not completely unexpected that they would have tried to settle this because it's also within the same breadth of, Android commitments that they're trying to understand and see how they can comply with broader CCI regulation. But this time in their commitments, they actually offered a new India agreement for OEMs for TVs. And they said that in this new commitment now, there won't be any compulsion for them to also sign up to YouTube if they simply want access to the Play Store. And Android folk TVs would also, have compatibility now. The key point, though, is that this isn't something which overhauls the existing regime. It's something that Google has proposed to introduce in addition to what's happening currently. So you have the current arrangement where you get the entire bundle. And then if you don't want it, you now have the option to switch to this new India agreement and regime where you pay a small licensing fee and you can, get the apps that you really want or the sort of, interface that you really want. Um, and this is something that the CCI has found to be compatible with the allegations raised and what the DG has found to be, anti-competitive so far. However, interestingly, there is one dissent as well. And the dissent from one of the CCI members notes that allowing the existing agreement to continue while simultaneously giving the option for a new agreement doesn't really address an anti-competitive concern. Because if you found the first agreement to be problematic, then you ought to have, told them to expunge it and only introduce the new regime. So he doesn't see how, this tandem play of both of them together will really lead to positive outcomes, or whether it'll even encourage OEMs to give up their existing free bundle and then pay a licensing fee and actually sign up for something new. So it's interesting, and we'll have to see whether, there's any action around it. The penalty in this case is also really, really low. It's about Indian 20 crores, which is a little bit more than 2 million US dollars. So penalty has been really low. They've really benefited from the settlement regime. And I don't think they could have got a better deal than what they have in this case. So that's really been an interesting outcome here in the last couple of months.
Indeed, and I wonder if you, on the top of your head, have any current development in the issues related to default setting and maybe choice screen. Is it something which is being discussed in terms of or kind of channeling, shaping behavioral remedies in a way where these fines are being almost ridiculed in terms of the size, or however high the fines are, it's still just cost signed off by the company of having this privileged position. Does India consider some interesting regulatory remedies which would address the behavioral issues?
Yes, the CCI has considered behavioral remedies. Largely Google has been the sort of, donkey for the testing of these things. So they've done this in the Google Android decision. They had 10 behavioral remedies that they imposed, out of which 6 were eventually upheld by the appellate tribunal. They've done the same thing again to Google in another decision regarding its Play Store billing policy, where they introduced several remedies for Google to allow third-party billing systems as well. In addition to the GBPS or Google billing system, which would allow then, these third-party payment providers access to end consumers. That's a decision also from last month itself. And apart from that, they've done it in other cases as well, including in tech cases. The interesting thing about these remedies is that they are uh, hits and misses. So some of them, you can read them and you can see the logic and you can understand how it intends to address the harm that has been identified. But in others, they seem to be an overstretch. They seem to be added in a good to have manner without considering whether the CCI is the right authority to have them and without considering the full length of implications as well. The one problem in the current system of remedies is that you don't know as a company if they're going to order remedies on you. You only find out when the final order is published. So because of that, there isn't a interaction, or there isn't a stakeholder consultation, or even the mandate to have an expert opinion on board to consider the various implications before ordering such remedies. So there is a power, it's being exercised in multiple tech cases. Sometimes it is hitting the right spot, but a lot of times it could do better with having a proper procedure in place to understand what's really needed, what's going to be the long-term impact of it, and how can we better use this power rather than um, trying to order them as if you're ordering like fast food somewhere, and there's just a bunch of fries that you collect and give to somebody. So there needs to be some sort of balance in the regulatory process of remedies as well.
As we witness the growth of many Indian maybe not big tech companies, but you mentioned that many unicorns emerging with really impressive regularity, and thus they accumulate a lot of data, and they have also innovation and fresh blood, energy, enthusiasm, etc. So I wonder, looking at one of the key markets in this regard, EdTech, do we see some interesting innovation, or it's again a repetition of the same programmatic stuff which we observe in other major jurisdictions?
EdTech is something that grew exponentially in India in COVID. During COVID, people took advantage of it. They enrolled in courses. However, some of these companies have unfortunately not performed as well post-COVID. They've got into regulatory hassles and burdens. Some are almost even out of business now. And very few have really stood the test of time. So it's not as great a success story as it would have been otherwise. Um, but it's something that hasn't come under the CCI scanner so far. At least it's not publicly known if it has. And it seems to be more of an issue regarding overall regulation of the education industry and more of a, data privacy policy sort of concern rather than a competition concern at this point.
We understand from the pure descriptive side that the digital markets require scale. Maybe it's stereotype. Some people contest it, but scale is the economy of scale and scope. It's self-evident. And with the mechanisms of such centralization and pervasiveness of some digital services, which are kind of underpinning core platform services in the DMA vocabulary, such as UPI perhaps, and digital ID, universal digital ID, one of the implications of such harvesting, indiscriminate harvesting of data 24/7 is privacy. So how powerful is the privacy argument overall in this discussion in India?
It's an argument which is being made, but the CCI or the competition regulator is not the right regulator to deal with it. We have, a Digital Personal Data Protection Act, which is, almost about to come into force in some time. Draft rules were released for it as well. And apart from that, we have various other digital regulators or government bodies that are in charge of the digital policy or data policy across the board. So they try to look into it and they see to what extent you can have regulation, to what extent should there be reporting, to what extent should there be disclosures, and to what extent should collection be a problem. But the CCI is not that body. So, from a competition point of view, we don't really see, much we don't see many concerns or much activity in that area. And where we do see it, it's probably unwarranted, at least as far as this regulator is concerned. But yes, there are the bodies in place. It is something that the government has taken note of. It is something which is on their radar. And, there are correct laws, provisions, and regulatory bodies to look into it.
When we sit and look at the map, we think India as if like a single word, but it's a
Mhm.
planet, yeah. So it's very diverse country where the relationship between the central government and local government can be very complicated and nuanced as well. So I wonder, does such level of development of digital markets, does it necessarily require strong subordination, strong centralization? Do we see some conflicting interest between different Indian regions? And does the central government try to fine tune and synchronize the interests? Because I project this discussion on the European Union, where obviously member states have their own plans, but also there is pan-European desire to build up something bigger.
Yeah, so we follow a federal model, which is, where we have these states. Each state has its own government, and then you have a central government in the capital, which sort of has overall jurisdiction and control over governance of the country. So, a little bit different from Europe, where every country is its own independent government, and then you come together in this voluntary process of harmony. um, in India, though, we see, despite there being various regions, as you've rightly pointed out, and the socio-economic capital of each region being very different, we see that through government initiatives such as UPI itself or Aadhaar, which was the unified ID system I was telling you about, those initiatives have helped bring digital interfaces and digital benefits to people across India. So UPI is something you can pay with, be it in the northernmost tip of India or the southernmost tip, east or west. It's accepted everywhere. There is infrastructure for it everywhere. And across small shops to large malls, you can do everything through UPI, including online payments through UPI. So these initiatives have been a game changer. However, as far as the digital infrastructure is concerned, for example, access to telecom towers or access to devices and SIMs that have 3G, 4G, 5G sort of data compatibility, in those spheres you see states and their infrastructure and their governments coming in and playing a larger role. But we see across the board largely there have been positive changes because all state governments do realize the importance of bringing the digital economy closer to their people and bringing access closer. So it isn't as much of a resource battle as you see between European countries and the Union. In Europe, there is a little bit more harmony here because the goal is unified and some of the resources are unified and available across the board.
India is also a democracy which looks around and try to learn from other jurisdictions, and obviously it understands how the US model works, how the European model works, how Chinese model works, how other success stories work. Do you see the presence? Which one is more dominant in your view, and which one appears to be more suitable for Indian situation?
Perhaps none of them, honestly. It would be wrong of us to mimic another jurisdiction's practices and policies without seeing how they suit us. And, we could have accused India of doing that in the past, but of late, the government and, stakeholders in India have understood the importance of having customized solutions that have long-term benefits for Indian people. So a lot of changes that we see from government infrastructure to even private infrastructure is customized and based on the requirement of Indian consumers. So something as simple as a food delivery app here may work a little bit differently as compared to how it would work in Europe or in the US, based on the way consumers are here, the amount of support they might need from customer service, the way they might prefer tracking their food, and the timelines they might be comfortable in receiving that food. So even a basic service like this, which shouldn't be so different across the world, has its own regional nuances. And similarly, you see other fintech platforms being customized, suiting Indian players, suiting Indian consumers in the same way. So there isn't going to be one regime that you can take and say, this is going to apply and this would be great for us. But I think what we try to do traditionally is look at international best practices and see what's best suited for our needs for a particular time. And perhaps that's why we're not rushing into digital competition, ex ante legislation as well, because we want to see if it's something that would work for us or not. Perhaps that's one of the considerations as well in the, implementation of that law. So it is customized.
You also, Raveena, alongside your practical experience and engagement, you're also an academic. So I wanted to end this conversation with inviting you to share your amicable recommendation to students who are beginning their um, engagement in this really exciting area of law. What is missing? What should they focus, and maybe what should try to avoid?
Yeah. Thank you. I mean, I love teaching. I do it, side by side with my regular job. And it's always interesting because you come in thinking you have more experience than, these children right out of school or right out of, basic university, but they come and surprise you in ways that you could never wonder. So it's always a fun process. And I think my only piece of advice for students is, um, read things as you come along, but don't take anyone's word for it. Look into concepts on your own and apply yourself in thinking whether a decision or a law or a proposal or a regulation is really the best approach to tackle a problem or not. And I think it's only when you exercise that independent judgment will you be able to be better lawyers, better thinkers, and better academics to come up with arguments that actually benefit the ecosystem as a whole. So I think that would be my only piece of advice.
Raveena Kumari Sethia, thank you very much indeed for this fascinating conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.